Thanks everyone for joining us today for a Carnegie Endowment discussion on California burning. My name is Noah Gordon. Before we bring in Catherine Blunt and talk about the book, I'd like to hand over to Ian Klaus, founding director of Carnegie California, who will say a few words about the work he and his team are doing in the state. Ian?
Thanks, Noah. I'm Ian Klaus, the founding director of Carnegie California. And of course, California is something of a unique creature. It is a subnational jurisdiction with an economy and population significantly larger than most nation states, an ecosystem of innovation that impacts behavior patterns, economies and governments around the world, and indeed a global actor in its own right, expanding the practice of subnational diplomacy. For all these reasons, the global issues shaping the 21st century affect and are affected by California and the west coast of the United States. And Carnegie California is here to help connect the dots, or the storms, or pixels, as it were. For the past year, I had worked as the series editor for the Summary for Urban Policymakers, an initiative that distilled IPCC AR6, some 8,000 pages of it, into 80 pages of scientifically rigorous, policy-relevant material for urban policymakers at the city, state, regional, national, and international levels. Among the essential points that stood out in AR6 and the Summary for Urban Policymakers that distilled from it was, first, there is no limiting warming to 1.5 without transformations of major systems, as well as collective action from a broad coalition that includes cities, states, regions, and industry. Second, this new solution set, while driven by the quickened pace of the climate crisis, of course, also reflects a new understanding of risk, how it cascades and compounds, how it moves across geographies and sectors. With that in mind, it couldn't be more timely or important to have a discussion today between Noah Gordon, the acting director of Carnegie's climate program, and Catherine Blunt on her new book about California. Thanks, Noah, and I'm very much looking forward to the next hour.
Thank you, Ian. It's great to hear all about your climate-related work, and I think it's fitting to have the founding director of Carnegie California kick off an event on California burning. Let's move from California to where I'm sitting in sunny Washington, D.C., where it's currently 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius in February, speaking of climate change. As Ian said, I'm the acting co-director of Carnegie's Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program. We focus our research on the broad, fascinating topic of how climate change and the responses to it will change international affairs, reshaping trade routes and diplomatic relations, stirring protests or even violent action, and changing the way that humans think about security and prosperity. So we're very pleased to have today an expert guest who's written a brilliant book on a topic that fits into our research, deadly natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change. There she is now. Catherine Blunt is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the author of California Burning, The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and What It Means for America's Power Grid. Highly recommended. Her coverage of PG&E was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and earned a Gerald Loeb Award, the highest honor in business journalism. Catherine and I will speak about the book for about half an hour before we move to audience questions for the last 10 minutes or so. You can put your questions in the YouTube chat. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us. Catherine, most people don't think too much about the utility that provides them with gas and electricity. After all, most of these utilities are regulated monopolies, and consumers don't have much choice who owns and operates the power lines in their neighborhood. So let's start at the beginning. What is Pacific Gas and Electric, and what made you decide to write a book about it?
Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, is the largest investor-owned utility in California. It serves about 15 million people in the northern and central part of the state. Has a very long and storied history. It's been around for more than 100 years at this point, and it's been very, of course, instrumental in promoting economic prosperity over the course of decades by building out some of the first infrastructure carrying power to fast-growing population centers. But over the last 20 years, it's been beset by enormous challenges, most significantly the fact that its infrastructure, much of which is aging, has ignited major deadly and destructive wildfires, and with enormous consequences. When I joined the Wall Street Journal in late 2018, it was 3 days before what would become known as the Camp Fire, which is the deadliest and most destructive fire in California history. It started when a very small hook on a century-old transmission tower broke and dropped a live wire that ignited a fire that killed 84 people. And so it became very clear from the outset that this was going to be my intense focus for a long time. And as Noah mentioned earlier, it resulted in a body of work that received some significant recognition. And from there, I think there was recognition within the book world that it could lend itself to book length treatment. And I was grateful for that opportunity because it is such a complex story.
It certainly was a great topic for a book. And, you mentioned the 84 tragic deaths in the Camp Fire. I think it's remarkable. In 2020, PG&E pled guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter in connection with that fire that destroyed the town of Paradise. It's pretty unusual for a utility to face manslaughter charges, right? So what sort of negligence did PG&E engage in that led to the indictment?
Highly, highly unusual, yes. So the finding was that the company had been recklessly negligent in maintaining its transmission system in the region where the fire occurred. And what that means is that prosecutors found, with a pretty thorough investigation, that the company had known of serious fire risk within the Feather River Canyon, which is specifically the origin point of the fire, and yet did little to nothing to mitigate that risk over many years. And it's significant in understanding that the charges were against the company itself. They weren't against any individual employees. And it does speak to this sort of complicated idea of corporate liability and what that means and what it means to engage in negligence, which I'm sure we can dive into more as we continue the conversation.
For sure. Your book also does a great job explaining the regulatory structure around utilities, which can sometimes create the wrong incentives. I mean, as you write, regulators allow utilities to earn returns on big capital investments like new power plants or new power lines, but they typically aren't allowed to earn returns on day-to-day projects like maintenance to make sure the power lines are running safely. So how does an investor-owned utility like PG&E that's providing a public service, how does it strike a balance between the interests of its shareholders and the interests of its customers who don't really get to choose who delivers them power?
Right. So as you spell out, it's a tough balance to strike. So the company is beholden to shareholders. The idea of the investor-owned utility is that solid financial performance will allow the company the access to capital needed to keep these systems running well and to continue to expand them. Worked very well, of course, in the 20th century as there was increasing demand for electricity and the need to invest in these large projects. We're kind of moving into a different era in that electricity demand was flat for a while, but of course is going to increase. So there's the need for large capital investments on that front. So the shareholder piece is important, but historically some utilities, PG&E included, have delivered some of those returns by minimizing day-to-day operating expenses. And if mismanaged, those kinds of cuts can have significant consequences. And in PG&E's case, one of the things that it did over the years was to reduce spending on inspections and maintenance, the types of spending on which it didn't earn a return, and use the savings to invest in the larger capital projects that add to the overall value of the system, add to the rate base, so to speak. And it is a challenging balance to strike. And so PG&E is not the only utility that has perhaps mismanaged this sort of spending over the course of a long period of time. It's one of those things or a dynamic in which the cuts are made incrementally over the course of time with little consequence until disaster occurs. So it's a really interesting question, and it really does a lot to explain what happened to this company over the last 20 years.
It's interesting to hear you say how it happened slowly. I thought one remarkable detail from your book, the hook that broke and caused a campfire was apparently purchased for 56 cents in 1919. Like, it's just things are fine until they're not, and all of a sudden it goes wrong. We'll come more to the future of the grid in a second. I wanted to, we've talked a bit about the human error and poor maintenance that played a role in these deadly California fires. I also want to bring in the climate change angle. These California wildfires were a topic in the 2020 U.S. presidential election when Donald Trump claimed that the cause of the fires was poor forest management, basically that California authorities weren't doing enough of things like small controlled burns to remove excess fuel from the forest floor. There's certainly some truth to that, but Trump already also dismissed climate change, even though dozens of academic studies have found that there is hotter and drier weather in the American West that is increasing wildfire risk. So from your reporting, to what extent do people in California blame climate change for this, or to what extent do they point out other factors like negligent land management or people sprawling into the wildland-urban interface?
I think that everyone who's engaged in the issue has a bit of a different perspective on what might be the most significant issue. And really the answer is it's a bit of all of the above, right? There's been internal mismanagement within PG&E over the course of many years, but there's other very relevant external factors that have very significantly influenced its circumstances, climate change being one of those things. As a result of several periods of very severe drought, tens of millions of trees died throughout Northern California, making the consequence of infrastructure failure, consequence of a power line sparking, significantly higher than it had been historically. So that's really important to understand. There's no downplaying that fact. And then, of course, many people want to point to the management of the forests. And there's been a push in recent years to do more controlled burns and to have more active forest management. And that's, I think, part of the solution as well. And then, of course, if we're talking about the consequence of infrastructure failure being higher in the sense of fires being larger and spreading more quickly, as the health of the forest decline, you also have more people living in the wildland urban interface, as you referenced, living in these high risk fire areas, and that's a really tough problem to solve. I mean, it's a tough thing to address in that, of course, the cost of living in California is very high. Some of these people have moved to these areas because the cost of living is less, and it's so there's my hope in writing this book was that anyone who reads it can kind of come to understand the issue holistically and the many factors that have coalesced over the years to create the particular risk sets of risks that the company has to address.
Got it. No, that's one of the tricky things about climate change is that it's rarely the only factor, but it's increasingly the decisive one. And climate attribution science is increasing, is getting better and more accurate. I'm going to jump ahead since you brought up the cost of living. There are a lot of connections between climate change and inequality, right? Like the average fridge in a rich country like the US consumes more electricity in a year than does the average person in Kenya or Nigeria. And wealthy people are also better equipped to handle the effects of climate change. You can turn on the air conditioner if it's too hot. Is there also a link between these California fires and inequality? Like, do these fires exacerbate the housing crisis, or can everyone afford to get insurance or pay to rebuild? What happens after one of these fires?
No, I mean, there's absolutely that element as well. And then just the sheer amount of destruction. And one interesting thing in California is that there's a certain liability construct. The wonky term is inverse condemnation, but what it means is that in the context of this discussion, if a utility, no matter whether it's a municipal utility, an investor-owned utility, whatever, if the infrastructure ignites a fire, the utility is liable for the damages that result from it. And in 2017 and 2018, between the companies, the fires ignited by the company's equipment resulted in more than $30 billion in damage. And some people who suffered property destruction and other things, they were underinsured, and so they become reliant on the sort of compensation that the company is able to provide in the wake of this. And the company was stressed to the brink, ended up going through a very complicated restructuring, and wasn't able to compensate victims in full. And so it's a very complicated set of circumstances. And it is true that in some cases, the places that are most vulnerable to fire are places in which people don't naturally have the means to rebuild. And that's there's even been some talk in recent years about whether people should continue to try, given the risk.
No, it's really troubling when there's already a housing shortage in the state. You talked a bit about regulation specific to California. Another great anecdote from your book. In a book about corporate malfeasance in the USA, it was no surprise to see Enron turn up. I was struck by one story you tell from the year 2000. A guy named Bill from Enron calls up a guy named Rick who runs a power plant in Las Vegas. And Bill says, "Hey, Rick, we want you guys to get a little creative and come up with a reason to go down, to take your power plant offline." Why did Bill from Enron want a power plant to go offline? And what does that tell us about electricity regulation or deregulation in California?
I'm sure a number of listeners here in California probably remember the California energy crisis of 2000, 2001. Wow, what a time. Like, I'm glad that I didn't actually have to cover that as a journalist. It was really, really complicated. But in the late 90s, across the US, you began to see talk of deregulating the electricity sector. And it's a bit of a misnomer because electricity delivery is always going to be regulated, right? There's always going to be some regulatory oversight because it's a critical service, more or less. And what this meant, though, was specifically hiving off power generation and allowing competitive power suppliers to compete in newly formed wholesale markets. And then the utilities would purchase that power and deliver it in most cases. California was one of the first states to really experiment with this in earnest. And the wholesale market design that they had initiated at the outset had some fundamental flaws. And then there was a period of supply scarcity, and the new competitive power suppliers recognized that they could drive up costs by falsely creating the perception of scarcity. And so in the case of this particular anecdote, Enron was involved in all of this. They were a big power trader, and they were essentially telling a power plant to go offline during a period of peak demand, which would elevate prices in the market. And the upshot of all of this was that the utilities ended up taking all of California's large utilities, PG&E, as well as its two counterparts in the South, took on large amounts of debt. PG&E was the only one of the three to file for bankruptcy. It was the company's first bankruptcy filing. And that had lasting consequences for the company. And so I was using deregulation to try to explain what that has meant for the company historically. There are other conversations to be had about what that's meant for power supplies broadly, but we can kind of go in any direction with that.
Let's go first about another 100 years into the past, because I really enjoyed the chapters on the history of electricity in California, particularly the story of renewables pushing out some fossil fuels in the early 20th century. You recount how Great Western, another competing power company, brings hydropower onto the grid in 1906, undercutting electricity from oil and coal. It's sort of a reminder that there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, humans have been using hydropower to generate electricity for a long, long time, and hydropower is still the largest source of renewable power globally, larger than wind and solar. Did doing historical research for this book change the way you thought about our modern electricity system in America?
Not necessarily, in that, I mean, it was such a oh my gosh, it was fun. The historical research was really fun because this early period, it was so dynamic. It was amazing to me that you would have these innovative, forward-looking people saying, okay, like, let's go into the mountains and let's build some hydroelectric powerhouses, having no idea what they were doing, right? And they somehow pulled it off. And what's amazing to me is that some of these assets are still functioning and functioning relatively well, so long as they have the proper maintenance. And a lot has changed since then. We have the model for delivering electricity has changed a lot. The needs have changed. And of course, there's a really significant question about how we are going to make use of the infrastructure that's there, which is, 80, 90, 100 years old in some cases, how to augment it, how to add to it, which is increasingly challenging, and how to manage the pace of change as we move from fossil fuels to adding more renewable energy. Managing that pace of change is proving difficult in different regions of the country. So it didn't necessarily change my thinking, but I think it is really interesting context as we think about the dynamics today.
Yeah, and to bring modern climate change in again, you have the drought in the American West that's raising fears about our ability to keep making hydropower from the Hoover Dam or from Lake Powell. And, another funny thing about reading old documents is you see that people back then called the white rapids that delivered hydropower white gold. And today some people call lithium white gold, and Americans are driving electric cars back in 1910, the heyday of Nikola Tesla rather than Elon Musk's Tesla, until advances in gasoline powered cars like Ford's Model T pushed the electric ones out of the market. Let's go to the future, because you just sort of alluded to it. As humans transition to renewable power and aim for net zero emissions, they need to expand and upgrade their power grids. I saw one Princeton study arguing that the U.S. needs to expand its power grid 60% by 2030. You need more power lines carrying more power. And as you said earlier, electricity demand is going up because we're increasingly heating our homes and charging our cars with electricity. So we probably need larger grids or macro grids to connect to new sources of power generation and allow for stability with variable renewables. So if there's no wind's not blowing in Oklahoma, you can bring in power from Texas and keep the lights on. So how do you think about the future of grid safety and reliability in the US? Like, how could more extreme weather and more reliance on renewables affect that?
So many different directions to take this question. For one, yes, I mean, we need huge amounts of new transmission. And that's a really challenging prospect. It takes a very long time to build large-scale transmission in this country today. Much different than it was 100 years ago. To your point, some of these really old transmission lines were built with very little difficulty, relatively speaking. So that is a challenge because we do need it to connect new sources of renewable energy to population centers. Without it, it becomes even harder to manage the pace of change of coal and gas plants retiring, whether because they're forced out of the market or because of policy decisions, or just broadly speaking, emissions reduction targets, and making sure that the new intermittent sources of energy can be it can balance the retirements. And of course, there's like large scale battery storage needed to augment that as well. So that needs to be addressed. And if you're talking about climate change, creating greater uncertainty in weather patterns, especially kind of the extreme weather events, many of which we've seen just over the last several years, it puts additional stress on the grid in a few ways. For one, as we've been discussing, a lot of these assets are old, and to have the additional stress increases the risk of failure. So utilities need to be spending to try to figure out what that greater uncertainty means, what that greater stress could mean for the health of the assets that they have. Other extreme weather events also affect the balance of power supply and demand, right? If it's really cold, everyone's using more electricity, same if it's really hot. And it is difficult for grid operators to maintain that balance as we are going through this transition in energy supply sources. Not to mention that a lot of the conventional assets that we have, oil and gas fired plants, they're old and have, in some cases, have probably been under-maintained over the years for a lot of different reasons. Just over the Christmas holiday, for example, some listeners may recall that in the Mid-Atlantic region, there were calls for electricity conservation as it got really cold. 46 gigawatts of fossil fuel-fired power plants stripped offline. And it's just really underscores the many complexities of moving into this brave new world that we're working toward.
Yeah, I think it's important that you point out that fossil fuels are not immune to the weather either. I mean, we know you don't get solar power when the sun's not shining, but like in Texas in 2021, so many natural gas power plants went offline because it was too cold as well. So we need to expand the grid, and it's, as you've said, renewables are getting cheaper, battery storage is getting cheaper, and we have the Inflation Reduction Act with all these tax credits to make it profitable to generate electricity from renewables. But what are some of the obstacles to doing so? What can prevent like a profitable renewable project from coming online?
All kinds of things. Well, we do have the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's an enormous amount of federal money kind of on the sidelines here, and all companies are trying to figure out how to best utilize it for their projects. And it's going to be a game changer in a lot of ways. But just the inflationary environment over the last several years has been a challenge. Supply chain challenges in particular have the potential to cause delays, increase prices. Wind and solar remain some of the cheapest forms of generation that we have today, but prices have gone up over the last several years as a result of this and other things. One of the sounds boring on the surface, but is really significant, is when you're connecting a new renewable energy project to the grid, you have to go through the grid operator. You have to go through a period of pretty intense technical and engineering studies to make sure that the new resource that you're adding is not going to disrupt the balance of supply and demand. Just how do you it's called the transmission interconnection process, and the lines to get through that process, so to speak, are really long in most regions of the country, and that has the potential to cause delays too. So there are, I've said this so many times on this call, but there's just so many challenges for developers to navigate right now, and utilities as well. More resources to kind of clear these log jams and other things might be helpful. There's been some provisions of not only the IRA, but the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is meant to address some of this, but there's no silver bullet.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of challenges. I was looking at a statistic about the interconnection queue before we got online that only about 1/5 of solar and wind proposals actually make it onto the grid. And I think in 2022, installations of large-scale wind and solar actually fell. I got a couple more questions for you before we bring in the audience. Maybe one for our international audience. I mean, so the fires that we're talking about, for which PG&E was found responsible, started when a rusty hook broke and a power line fell. It sparks vegetation in the area, or a tree branch gets too close to the power line. Why aren't the power lines underground? That's the case in many other countries. Why are so few US power lines buried underground for safety?
Well, in Europe, a lot of the lines were underground after World War II. There was a lot of destruction and the need to rebuild, and there was kind of, I think, a recognition at that point that it was prudent to put a lot of that infrastructure underground. So that's one reason. In the US, we simply we're working with what we had, 80, 90, 100 years ago in many cases. And there wasn't really that opportunity to do the full scale rebuild like there was in some regions of Europe. But historically as well, it has been more expensive to put lines underground than overhead. And that's one of the impediments that exists today, especially if you're talking about like retrofitting everything. But they are underground in some places. I mean, the utilities in Florida have been doing more undergrounding to minimize the risk of severe disruptions after hurricanes. And it should be said that in the wake of the major wildfires that PG&E has caused over the last number of years, especially 2017, 2018, they now have a plan to bury 10,000 miles of distribution wire, which is it would be the single largest undergrounding project any U.S. utility has ever undertaken.
Wow.
It's going to be difficult. It's going to be expensive, but they are committed to it. So we'll see how that goes.
As with so many climate issues, I guess you have to ask, action is expensive, but is it cheaper than inaction is going to be the question.
Exactly.
With projects like
that. And the calculus on that is changing.
Going back to climate change in the future, when you look at the latest IPCC report that Ian was talking about at the top, are you worried that these wildfires are going to get more damaging as it gets hotter and possibly drier in certain regions? And how can Californians adapt if they do get worse?
Right. No, I do think that is that's the consensus. It's a real risk. And in terms of adaptation, there's a lot of discussion about how do you protect yourself, right? How do you protect your property? Well, for one, there are discussions in ways that there haven't been historically about whether people actually do want to move or buy property in the same way that they might have wanted to 10 years ago. That's one thing. But in terms of the property that you have in all the regions surrounding San Francisco, as well as many other areas of Northern California, being at high risk for so long, they're trying to figure out how to create defensible space, right? How to make it so that if there is a fire, the chance of property damage is less. I think that, so there are a number of different measures that people can take individually. What this means for the utility companies going forward is a different question. I think that seeing PG&E get into such dire financial straits over the last few years had major consequences for the economy in California, compensation for fire victims, just so many other factors. And that's going to be something that policymakers are going to have to think really critically about going forward. And I think that the challenge only gets more acute as time goes on.
Certainly troubling. I'm going to ask you a hopeful question before we get into recommendations and the audience questions. Some are starting to come in, so thank you for submitting those. We've talked about projections of more climate damage, worse wildfires. What gives you hope about the future of the electricity system in California? What's a positive development that you've seen in the past couple of years?
I always say, if there's any positive aspects to the PG&E story, it's that PG&E has never been more aware of the risks that it faces. And there are people who are really enthused about trying to figure out how to address some of this in a meaningful and lasting way. The company has very smart people working for it, some very bright engineering minds, very bright business minds. The new CEO is really committed to making a lasting change. So in that sense, it appears they've moved in the right direction. That doesn't make the challenges less difficult to address, but at least they have a different mentality than they've had historically. And I think that the Southern California utilities have been addressing wildfire risk in earnest for longer than PG&E. So they are in some ways sort of ahead of the game on that. But there's also been a lot more information sharing between the big investor-owned utilities, and kind of best practices have evolved. They're not competitors, right? They're all in this together and trying to figure out how to have a sustainable future, financially, environmentally. And so I'm hopeful in that sense, but cautiously so.
Cautiously so. I'm going to ask you for some recommendations before the audience questions. So if someone really liked your book, what's another book that they should read? Maybe it's on a similar topic, or also about electricity grids. And another recommendation, what's some of your other reporting that people should check out? I mean, you've been writing on a host of other subjects. If they enjoyed your book, what's another article by Catherine Blunt that you recommend?
If you enjoyed the book and you're interested in understanding some of the challenges that we face in the energy transition broadly, I will recommend I have a close former colleague named Russell Gold. He wrote a book called Superpower, which is about the challenges of building out transmission in the United States. It's a good lens through which to view a number of different aspects of the sector. Shorting the grid, we've been talking a lot about power supplies, and I don't get into that so much in the book, but balancing power supply and demand going forward, managing the pace of the transition, as we were talking about, is really going to be a critical challenge within the next 5 years, I think. And I think shorting the grid is really good context for understanding why. In terms of what bears on the reliability of the grid generally, I had an article around this time last year that looked at 3 major factors affecting reliability: age of the power grid being one, climate change, and managing the pace of the transition. And I would hope that it spells it out simply enough that it's kind of a good grounding and a good springboard to kind of begin asking more questions and reading other things.
Got it. I'm going to turn to the first of our audience questions. Someone's asking, what's the state of play for offshore wind in California?
Well, there was an auction for the first time just very recently. It didn't fetch as much as some of the East Coast auctions because it's deep water out here. It is more challenging to build offshore wind. It has to be floating. It can't be anchored to the bottom of the ocean. So there's some different engineering challenges associated with that. Cost management is going to be key, but California has big offshore wind goals, and there has been some interest so far. So we'll see how that progresses.
Yeah, definitely, certainly a promising area. We have another audience question on asking, what are your views on the municipalization of electric utilities? Are these issues with PG&E inherent in investor-owned utilities specifically?
In some ways,
I know
yes.
you talked in your book about San Francisco basically trying to get away from PG&E. I mean, they said, didn't they offer for $2.5 billion, hey, we'll buy all of your assets and all the wires, and tried to get out, and they couldn't. So yeah, are these problems, do all investor-owned utilities face problems like this?
In terms of, if we're talking about problems that stem from the profit motive, i.e. the tendency to cut operations and maintenance spending, potentially with safety consequences in order to free up money to make capital investments, yes, that's a challenge that it's a balance that all investor-owned utilities are tasked with striking. Some do it better than others. And for PG&E, the consequences have been more acute than we've seen elsewhere, right? Elsewhere, maybe the consequence is infrastructure failure, but it results in power outages. It doesn't result in wildfires, right? And so, yes, it is. In terms of municipalization, specifically speaking of San Francisco, it is really hard for municipalities to break away from the investor-owned utilities. San Francisco's had a difficult time. The city of Boulder and Colorado has had a difficult time. There's been other examples. And the argument that the investor-owned utilities make is that when a significant population center wants to become its own municipal entity, it kind of has the potential to append the financial model that they have, right? It's less revenue that they're collecting. And so as a result, there are higher costs of maintaining the system imposed on those who remain. There's some truth in that, right? I mean, if San Francisco itself were to become a municipal utility, it wouldn't be that significant because the city itself isn't that large. It's really the entire Bay Area that makes up the really significant revenue base that PG&E has. But there's a lot of practical challenges associated with that. In terms of like a broader conversation about municipalization or whether the state should take over a utility like PG&E, it's a tough question because there's like a real legitimate discussion to be had about what would happen if the profit motive was removed. But any potential alternative model introduces other challenges. So there's no perfect solution. So if PG&E is owned by the state, it becomes a taxpayer issue, and there's still the same financial liability construct, right? And it would take a lot of state resources. And so, and the same people who work there now would probably work at the company, no matter who owns it, right? So there's kind of issues with management generally. But I think there's a philosophical discussion to be had there, but there's also just the practical reality of changing the model that's in place and wresting control from shareholders if we're talking about investor-owned utilities. And it's my view that it's not going to change anytime soon. So the question that I think is more relevant is, how do we make what we have work better?
Got it. Another question from the audience. Someone's asking, with the tax on the U.S. power grid on the rise, what are some practical solutions to combating these types of attacks on critical infrastructure?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. When you think about the grid and how expansive it is, right? Kind of far-flung power plants, wires that traverse many, many, many miles, substations in remote areas. It's impossible to secure it all, right? No utility has the ability to secure all of its infrastructure from these kinds of attacks. It would be like practically difficult. It would be very expensive. These attacks are not new. Actually, PG&E had a very significant attack on one of its large-scale substations in 2013, and it really kind of awakened the industry to the fact that this stuff is vulnerable to like physical attack and not just cyber. And after that, there were some stronger requirements put in place for securing large-scale substations. Regulators are looking right now as to whether those standards need to be applied to a broader range of assets. But I was talking to one utility the other day about this, and they said, that's one aspect of the equation. We also need to be investing in resiliency so that in the case there is a disruption, the power can keep flowing, kind of building redundancies into the system, because some attack or risk of attack is inevitable.
Yeah, we have another question about resilience, and maybe that's another hopeful area. Like, it's a challenge. The grid does need to adapt for two-way flow. This old system since Thomas Edison is one big power generator sending load, and now it gets more complicated to manage power going in both directions. You have to adapt the lines, people, sending power from their home battery or electric car onto the grid.
Right.
So someone's asking about how will CPUC's microgrid incentive program impact PG&E's planned expansions? Are these microgrids more resilient than larger transmission networks?
Well, it's when you think about one thing that PG&E has been doing over the last several years is proactively shutting off power during really risky times of the year, most often in the fall when the winds pick up and have the potential to disrupt distribution lines, tree branches flying, trees falling. So the microgrid effort, in part, is meant to keep some of the communities in these areas online when PG&E feels the need to shut off distribution. And so that is a resiliency play for sure. And so it might make it so that the power is more reliable in these areas where it's become very risky for PG&E to serve. And it is, generally more resilient than a large scale transmission network. Yes, because it's more localized.
I think the demand response is amazing. I mean, it's sort of encouraging how California consumers are helping keep the grid stable. Twice in the last 3 years, the state grid operator texted Californians asking them to conserve energy, and both times they did it and avoided rolling blackouts. Another question about the sort of future of electricity sources. Someone's asking, are you concerned that with the rising cost of electricity and constant outages, loss of reliability, are you concerned this will discourage people from moving to sustainable options like electric cars, electric appliances?
Oh, it's definitely a concern, for sure. I mean, one of the big challenges for all of the California utilities going forward is going to be cost management, because there's a lot of capital spending needed on wildfire risk reduction, but also preparing for this greater era of electricity demand, right? And if it's really expensive, that creates a challenge. And if you're in an area where, your power is going out multiple times a season or even multiple times a week in some places, electrifying everything presents a real risk. And I have heard anecdotally, some people, even people really enmeshed in the climate space, true believers in carbon reduction over time, are like, I'm just not in a place with my family in which I can do that comfortably. So that's certainly a risk.
Guess some people worry about putting all their eggs in one basket. I mean, electricity is a better way to power things, but if the power goes out and you also lose your heat and you also lose, it's tough to
you lose your
everything.
heat, your ability to cook. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the gas stove debate, we could do a whole nother event on that. I know you've written about that as well. Maybe there's some lessons, this is another audience question. Are there some lessons from California that might be useful for other states and for other countries? And, as you said, not every state has a wildfire risk, right? But what lessons from California's grid management and future planning might be useful for other states or other countries?
Well, we have a whole nother discussion on this. But one thing I will say, there's an irony in the book that I think is important to point out, which is that California policymakers for years are very, very focused on long-term carbon reduction targets. And the heroic element of the story is that California utilities were very early. They spent a lot of money early on renewable energy projects, in part helping to create the economies of scale that have driven down costs to the levels that they are today. That's great. But one thing about these early contracts is that they were really expensive, and they added to some of the expense pressure that PG&E and the other utilities were facing. And there are some trade-offs associated with that. And that's it is sort of a dark irony. And it was in focusing so much on the future, policymakers and people within PG&E really failed to recognize the extent of the risk, in part driven by climate change, that was emerging while they were doing all of this. And so I think taking a more holistic view of how risk is emerging is important for grid planning broadly, whether it be in the US or elsewhere. And but there's a lot of lessons to be taken away, not just that.
For another time. No, you're sort of touching on, so what this question makes me think of is the question of narratives and the social side of the transition. Like, I think it gets really hard to explain to people, yes, wind and solar and renewables are the cheapest form of power, but your bill is still growing up because we need more transmission or because they're variable. That's a really hard line to walk, to say that this is the best way to do it, and yet your bill keeps going up. So I think there could be some blowback there. We have another audience question on collaboration between local governments and the federal government in this space. Someone's bringing up the federal state offshore wind implementation partnership. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the relationship between California and the federal government as it relates to PG&E and these crises.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's been interesting to see. There's been just such active federal policymaking around, climate targets and the role that utilities and electrification is going to play in that. It's not a question that I'm super well positioned to answer necessarily, other than to say that there's going to be a lot more interplay going forward with the implementation of some of the Biden administration policies.
Yeah, and with the dispute that's brewing between California, other Western states, and the federal government about water use. I mean, that's we sort of talked about.
That's a whole other topic, but yeah, absolutely.
Hydropower, absolutely. We got time for one final audience question, and it's about nuclear power. What's California's best option for consistent baseload power, especially with the eventual retirement of Diablo Canyon, the nuclear power plant?
Well, it's certainly interesting to see the extension of Diablo Canyon. That was an about face for the governor. In recognition that there's a major electricity supply challenges this year and going forward. Hopefully the hydro situation will be a little bit better after this season of precipitation, but it remains a big challenge throughout the West. And so I think it's only a temporary extension right now, but there's enough variables that'll affect electricity supplies over the next few years. It'll be fascinating to see whether there's another extension.
Yeah. Okay, we're just about out of time. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you also to the audience from around the world for joining us. Really appreciate it. Make sure to read Catherine's book, follow her reporting, and join us next time for more programming from the Carnegie Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.
A real pleasure. Thank you.